history, traumatic personal experience, the horrors of brutal war, and the skill of producing a graphic novel which combines all three. I'm John Elliott, I'm a journalist. I lived in India for 25 years, starting initially at the beginning of the Tamil Civil War in the early mid-80s. Our author is Benjamin Dix, with his amazing graphic novel, Vanni, which has been published in London and in America as well as in India, and I recommend this version because it's much lighter than the copy in. We've got a photograph being taken. Ben was a UNDP worker in northern Sri Lanka after the tsunami. He went there just after the tsunami in 2004 and was there till the UN withdrew him and other aid workers because the civil war in 2008 had got too close to comfort and they couldn't guarantee the safety. Ben was more than horrified by being withdrawn. In fact, he was traumatized by the experience, as he'll be explaining. And eventually, after a few years, he came around to producing this book, this graphic novel. It's a PhD thesis, as well as being a highly readable and highly viewable book. The pictures from it will be revolving on the screen while we talk. Are you controlling this, or is it just revolving? Yeah. Is it going to revolve automatically, or are you going to click?
I'm controlling it.
You're in charge. Okay,
Are there
good.
pictures on the screen? Not yet. There we go.
One more point before I let Ben tell us all about it. The defense minister in charge of Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka at the time, in the 80s, was Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is now the president. He's the brother of Mahindra Rajapaksa, who was the president at the time. It would be very tempting, especially for me as a journalist, to spend most of the rest of the session discussing Sri Lankan current politics, but we're not going to do that. That is not our subject for today. Ben wants, quite understandably and rightly, to talk about his experiences, because that's what the book's all about. So Ben, tell us briefly, to begin with, the story of your arrival there, what you saw and what you experienced.
Thank you. Before I answer that, can I just thank a couple of people? Is that all right? Just because when it's like artillery going off again, isn't it? Just because I often find myself sitting here talking about this book, and like with any kind of project like this, there is a team behind a piece of work like this. So I just wanted to thank, firstly, Namita, Shonjoy, and William for inviting me to Jaipur, Manasi and Shruti from Penguin for publishing this book, my wonderful agent, Kelly Falconer, for taking me on, and my wonderful new wife, Beth Worku, for helping me pull me out of a very dark hole of trauma of this book and showing me a whole new life. Thank you all. So I started a brief history of how this all came about. I was a photojournalist here in India. I was working in Delhi and Bombay as a freelance photographer with Shonjoy, with his Salambalek Trust in Delhi, and the tsunami hit on Boxing Day 2004. An old university friend of mine was working for an NGO up in Vanni, which is northern Sri Lanka, just below Jaffna. And it was Boxing Day, there were no expats, humanitarian work was on hold over the Christmas period. And so I thought I was going over there for about 10 days to help him out. And I ended up staying there for 4 years. I got there to a completely ravaged area of the northeast of Sri Lanka, but what I also found in the interiors was a geographically, environmentally stunning place. It's one of the poorest districts in Sri Lanka. And I was immediately touched by the hospitality, the kindness, the gentleness of the Tamil community there. But also what contrasted it was the ravage of war that had been through there for over 30 years. Almost every family had been affected by the conflict, had a member who was a Karda in the Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Land, the rebel group in the north, which we'll, I think, refer to as the Tigers or Tamil Tigers. And I found myself in this politically fascinating post-natural disaster environment, and I had a degree from SOAS University in geography and started to put that to use, because what I found was the community were confused by what had happened in the tsunami. These were communities that worshipped the sea, that ran pujas on the beaches, and suddenly, you know, the sea, the goddess, had ravaged this community and killed in the Vanni alone nearly 16,000 people. So the first few weeks were really running around finding endless bodies lost in hedges, in bushes, and picking up bodies and taking them into these mass graves, and going back home every night and trying to come to terms with the enormity of this natural disaster. I started to build a geography project which looked at talking about the geographical effects of a tsunami. The superstitions were there, that people felt that they had been affected by it because they were seen as terrorists. There were ideas that the Americans had put a nuclear bomb under the sea that had caused the tsunami. So we started to create this kind of geography program, and I did it as an illustration, as animations, a PowerPoint animation. We put up bed sheets between the palm trees and shine these projections up into the trees, and have people who had been affected by the tsunami kind of be taught about the geographical side of it. And I got to know the community, and I think back then I was 28, I was a kind of budding anthropologist, and started to photograph and interview the average person, the civilian in the Vanni, and realized the struggle that was going on between the Tamil Tigers and the government. And it was such a nuanced, complex environment of the relationship between the Tamil and the Tiger that really started to fascinate me, that there was such a strong support for the Tigers and this sense of injustice, that the Tamil community had been disenfranchised since independence, been pushed away, their languages stripped, their ability to access universities, the civil service, and the encroachment of the Sri Lankan government deeper and deeper, the army deeper and deeper into the community, that made me want to start to really research this area. And so in 2005, as we started to rebuild after the tsunami, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the president, came in on this wave of Sinhalese nationalism with a drive to rid this country of terrorism. And off the back of kind of waving the flag of the international war on terror that they were seeing in Afghanistan, Iraq, I think they waved that flag kind of very strongly at the UN and in EU meetings in Brussels, that they also had a terrorist problem in the country. I don't think they found a huge amount of appetite for it in the West, but China jumped on that bandwagon and basically bankrolled the conflict there. And the push started to come from the south as the army started to push and squeeze the Tamil Tigers deeper and deeper into the Vanni where we were based. And so I was running around taking photographs, always focused on the human story, on the civilians. I wasn't so interested in the politics, the rulers of these conflicts, the two heads, but these civilians and their stories of their years and years of pushing was fascinating. As a UN worker, I wasn't allowed to get too close to the Tigers. As a bad UN worker, I got very close, and I started to interview individuals, and it really disrupted my view of what a terrorist was. I had grown up with this idea, and especially, since 9/11, of an idea of what a terrorist looked like. And suddenly I was meeting young women, young men who had been pushed to an extreme that they felt they had no choice but to fight in this struggle of independence. And as a story I often tell of my mother and father when they came up to the Vanni, and no one really ever brought their parents up to visit them in the Vanni. It was a war-torn, dangerous place full of landmines and unexploded ordnance. And I took my parents up there, and we went across the government lines, and my father was bought a whole plate of cakes and tea and coffee, and the tigers in their fatigues that you see there were saying, you are welcome to the Vanni, we will look after you, you'll be safe here. And he got back in the car and just said, these are bloody nice terrorists. And that always resonated with me, that on an individual level, these were absolutely charming people that I was meeting.
But you didn't meet Prabhakaran?
I didn't meet Prabhakaran, no.
Prabhakaran being the leader of the Tamil Tigers.
But you did?
I did, and he didn't, and I wouldn't have offered him a bunch of grapes or whatever it was.
You wouldn't, no. So on the girls that you see here in these pictures, it disrupted this idea of what a terrorist looked like. And I started to interview them and get an understanding of their backgrounds and where they'd come from and what their view of the world was. I was meeting leaders of the Tigers who had studied at the London School of Economics, who had studied at Oxford, who had gone back, who was trying to set up this pseudo-state under incredibly intense pressure and international pressure. And it was a fascinating area to work.
Can I just pick up the Prabhakaran one, which I'd forgotten until you prompted me? I met Prabhakaran in Delhi in a hotel called, I think it was the Intercontinental, somewhere, obscure little hotel. And I was escorted into this room, and there was sitting this man in a woolen pullover and brown trousers and totally nondescript looking. And I sat there wondering, well, is he Prabhakaran or am I being set up? So I said, are you Prabhakaran? And he said, well, who else am I? So I got on with the interview. Back to you. Oh, by the way, while we've got this up, we'll come back to this later on how you wrote the book, but this shows how many of the pictures in the book are actually based on photographs that you took.
Exactly. So, like John said, we'll go on into the methodologies of how I took...
Later, but this is a lovely example of it.
Yeah, exactly. So what I've tried to do here on some of these photographs that I've taken is Lindsay, the illustrator of the book and my co-author, he's taken the photographs that I took, hours and hours of video footage of work that we did with Channel 4 on a documentary called No Fire Zone, and then thousands of pictures on the internet, and has based pretty much all of the drawings on those photographs. So this is really a piece of non-fiction fiction, but we'll get into that in a minute.
Back to your chronology.
Yeah, so the chronology was meeting these people, and in 2007, the conflict really started to spiral. So at that point, the army was pushing further and further north into the Vanni, and people living on the periphery were moving closer into the centre. And what happened on the first displacement is that people had, like the people you see on the truck here, had a time to move. They could feel the army coming up from the south. They had a bit of disposable income. They had a bit of space to be able to load their belongings onto a truck like this, onto a tractor, and move away from the encroaching army. And as you can see, this is actually the first picture illustration that Lindsay took, that Lindsay drew before I even met him. I emailed him that photograph, and he, about 3 days later, sent me back that illustration. And I realized at that point there was something special here, and this was a book that we could make. So as people were moving closer and closer into the city of Kilinochchi, where we were based as the UN, we started to see the attacks, the air attacks, the artillery attacks coming from the army, and the Tigers using the population as human shields in Vanni. We were caught there as the UN in the middle of all of this, and our area of operation began to decrease intensely. So before the conflict, after the tsunami, we could access all areas of the Vanni. By the time this was taken in early 2008, we were really kind of pulled into a 2-kilometre squared area around Kilinochchi. And I spent hours sitting in bunkers, in UN bunkers, which were fortified, which would be able to withstand a direct hit. Apparently, we never got one, luckily. But when I found myself suddenly out on my motorbike in the town, and you would hear the of this aircraft coming over, I would have to dive into a civilian bunker. And I, got images like this where you could the difference of experience between the civilians in a bunker and us UN in the bunker was so extreme. And so I started to record all of this photographically and interviewing people and building up a huge database of people's stories and struggles. And as you can see again, Lindsay photographed that, illustrated that. Before we left, as the conflict really started to spiral in September 2008, the United Nations were told that we would have to leave. And this was something that we kind of saw coming, but was still incredibly traumatic for us. Myself, I'd been there by that time for 4 years and had made wonderful friends within the community and our over 100 staff of Tamil staff. And you can see from that photograph that it started to turn into chaos. What was before a couple of people moving away from the borderlands suddenly became this intense movement of people, nearly 500,000 people on the move trying to get away from the battle zones. And it became, chaotic and dangerous. There were bombs going off everywhere. And we were, as the UN, found ourselves there as witness, as international witness of what was happening. And that became probably the most important job that I had at that time, was I felt to record this. So I started... Sorry.
This is a rather interesting one, because the trees have been turned into something rather threatening.
Yes.
A lot of quite gentle trees there, and you get the sense from those trees. It's an interesting example of what an artist can do in a graphic novel.
Yeah. And also with the graphic novel, again, we'll get onto the methodologies, but Lindsay can take a photograph like that and obviously turn the camera around so people are coming towards you, the reader, rather than away from you. And so this started to turn into a completely chaotic scene, and for the last 10 days that we were there before the evacuation, I went out a number of times, again, against the wishes of my bosses at the UN. I snuck out on my motorbike and tried to take photographs as much as I could of how we were leaving the community. And we were leaving them like this. I think this is one of the most stark images I've ever taken. This is how we left 500,000 people, with really just, the shirts on their backs. And it was a complete tragedy of a failure of the United Nations that we had been there through those years of post-tsunami development. But when the bombs really started to fall, it was the expats, the Westerners, who were being evacuated. And so for the last 8 days before the UN evacuation, we were hauled up in our compounds with Tamil civilians pleading outside our compounds for us to stay. They understood that we were no longer able to offer humanitarian assistance, but us being there, our international presence was witness to the war crimes of the Sri Lankan army, of dropping bombs on civilian infrastructure, and the possible forced conscription by the Tamil Tigers of civilians into the ranks. And do you want to jump in?
I was going to say, this must be one of the most traumatic pictures in the book. There are many other horrific pictures of bodies being blown up and people being shot and killed, but this is the trauma that lived with you.
Kind of, yeah. Yes.
The helplessness.
The helplessness, but the shame of this. This was some of those hands that are coming through those fences are the hands of people that I had known for 4 years, of people that I had dinner with, the people that I had been to christenings, to weddings, to funerals, to Sunday lunches, to days on the beach, and suddenly I was behind this UN gate, and they were pleading with us to stay. And the same for my Tamil staff, who understood that they also wouldn't be able to leave. So the Tigers had an exit system that they would not be able to leave the Vanni without the Tiger passes. And so they had this horrific choice. I was, at this point, 32 years old. So I had engineers of ours coming up to me who were in their 40s with children and families asking me what they should do. Should they relocate with me and leave their family back in the Vanni to the bombs, or do they stay with their family? And these became, emotional, ethical decisions that was, just way over any of our heads to deal with this kind of enormity and this kind of intense panic of what was happening.
How did you answer that?
You didn't. There is no answer to that. What do you do? And most of them stayed, and 32 of them died. And it was. There is no answer to that. There's no advice you can give. There was still a sense that if they evacuated with us, they would be able to come back into the Vanni. But I was quite sure that wasn't going to happen. It was clearly going to be pincered by the government, and this was going to end. I had no idea at this point the atrocity that was about to happen, but it was quite clear that there was not going to be movement backwards and forwards into the Vanni. So we stayed there for about 5 days, barricaded into our UN compounds with these screams and chants outside. Incredibly difficult environment to be in, and just shameful. It was horrific. So on the morning of September the 16th, 2008, we lined up and we drove out of there. And I was told very clearly by the UN that I wasn't allowed to film or photograph the evacuation, so I filmed and photographed the whole evacuation. And came back and took all of this footage to the BBC and then to Channel 4 and tried to show what we had left behind, what the atrocities were. We drove out of there, and the next day I quit my job.
You had no option to stay.
We could not stay in the UN. I mean, at that point there were 8 internationals in that convoy. And I was in, as you can see, the last vehicle. My UN boss actually made me drive the car. Everyone, so
make
that
sure you left.
So one, to make sure I left, and 2, so I wouldn't photograph the evacuation. And so when I took that picture, one of my drivers, who should have been the Tamil driver, is sat in the passenger seat doing the gears for me so I can photograph the thing. Because I knew these pictures would be important. I didn't know what for, but I knew that was the thing that I needed to do, was record everything. So we got out of there. It was an incredibly dangerous evacuation. You basically had the army on the right of the road and the LTTE, the Tigers, on the left of the road. And at that point, you thought anyone could take a pot shot, blame the other, and we would become this kind of political pawn in the conflict. Luckily, no one did. We got out of there, but we had to drive through a fresh air attack. And as we were driving out, it was almost symbolic that 2 Sri Lankan Air Force jets flew over into the Vanni, and you could hear the explosions in the background. So we went out, and the next day I resigned my post out of shame, out of exhaustion, out of complete lack of faith of what the UN stood for at that point. Flew back to the UK and tried to find myself after 4 years. It was an incredibly difficult moment. So I stayed for about a month in the UK. Did this work with the media, with BBC and Channel 4, and then actually came here. And I came here to JLF in 2009 in January, when the JLF was tiny. There was, I think the crowd that is in this hall right now was almost like the crowd that was at JLF.
In the early days of the festival.
Yeah, I think it was the second festival. And I found myself completely lost. I mean, I was thinking about this morning, how we, all of us will suffer trauma through our lives, and the difference for me with this trauma was that it was built from shame and guilt. And that was something that I was constantly wrestling with, was I consider myself a pretty loyal, solid friend, and to leave my staff behind in that situation was something that I could not come to terms with. It was incredibly traumatic. And so this is what I witnessed from the outside of Sri Lanka for the next 7 months, was images like this of that whole community being pushed up onto the beach of northeast Sri Lanka, nearly 250,000 people, and completely bombarded with all kinds of weapons. The Sri Lankan government constantly spun the notion that they weren't using heavy weapons, but now we've found remnants of cluster bombs, of artillery, and it was quite clear that they bombarded that area.
And by this time, Rajapaksa had decided that the Tamil Tigers had to go.
Absolutely.
I mean, this was the big attack.
This was the big push, and that's where it became really interesting, the distinction between the Tamil and the Tiger, that this was just a complete obliteration of this community on this beach.
And then very quickly through the next, because we're slightly getting short of
Sorry,
time.
yeah.
But no, very quickly through the next thing. Shall we go straight to the Uber driver into the book? The book begins with an Uber driver in Stoke Newington, and he's got young passengers in the back who discover where he's from and chatter about the island's magical beaches and resorts with crystal-free ocean, palm trees and cocktails by the pool. Not quite the Sri Lanka that the Uber driver remembered, but he can't reveal who he is because he's an illegal immigrant, I guess, in London. So that's where the book starts, and then we go back to the beginning and tell us how you found the people. There's a couple of families there. Mm-hmm. Who are they? How did you design the story? So let's move on to that.
Sure. So in 2012, I was still getting messages from people who had survived the conflict, who had found themselves as refugees in Chennai, who had found themselves as asylum seekers in London and Zurich. And these were people that I'd known from Vanni. So that's Lindsay there and myself, looking quite chuchi about 8 years ago, sitting sitting in Delhi. I had far more hair back then.
No cap either.
No, I had hair. I didn't need a cap. And so Lindsay came on board, and let's do this book. So we were in my friend's house in Delhi, and we started to put the story together. My 4 years experience, UN reports, Amnesty International reports, it's all laid out in the bibliography of the book here. And we started to build a story arc. I then communicated with these 20 families, London, Zurich, and Chennai, and with their permission started to do huge, long life history interviews with them. So really going back to their childhood, who were they, where they were born, not just on the conflict, but really getting a sense of who these people were as human beings, and started to put together this narrative that we were making the graphic novel. And so I would fly backwards and forwards between Chennai, Zurich, and London, and go through these long interviews. As we made the script, I realized that I didn't want to create a piece of journalism. This was going to be an ethnography. And so with the methods of that was to take people's testimonies, turn it into a script, and then take that script back to the people and say, does this look like your story? Is that, help me edit this story so it's your story, not my story.
And you didn't go to Jaffna? You didn't go to northern Sri Lanka?
At that point, I wasn't overly welcomed in Sri Lanka. After the Channel 4 film and the BBC, I kind of called the Rajapaksa's war criminals, and they didn't like that.
But also, you would have been, they would have gone and attacked, or
yeah,
the people you talked to would have become targets.
Exactly. I didn't know my safety in the country, and I certainly did not want to be seen interviewing anyone in that country, and then the footprint that I could have left
and
there.
then you merged some of the people into
so
how
exactly.
many families?
So 20 families, London, Zurich, and Chennai. and we merged those 20 interviews into one fictionalized family. And I realized at that point, so this is Anthony, the protagonist, and he's from Champion-Patu, from a village in east of the Vanni. And by merging these 20 interviews into this one protagonist family, it completely anonymized the family. So the government, the Tigers, no one could go after this family. They didn't exist. They're a cartoon family who are in the book, but they live out the experiences of these 20 interviews. And so Lindsay and I started to build this narrative from my photographs he was drawing, and with the help of these 20 participants, collaborators with us, into this narrative of what you see through the book, of people's experiences of migrating through there. And so at that point, I think the trauma, this became quite a cathartic exercise for me in some respects. I couldn't leave it alone. There was no way that I could walk away from what I had witnessed in Sri Lanka. And so I really struggled with how we were going to tell this story, and the participatory methodologies was the thing that was so important, that this wasn't going to be my story. This needed to be, this is before the Arab Spring. So when the Tamil population started to see things happening in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, they were so confused. Why is this getting all this media attention and all of this UN backing and all of this potential to help when the Sri Lankans got nothing? And so there was a real kind of, we died in vain. No one knew our story. And it was quite clear that had Sri Lanka had oil off the north coast of Jaffna, or there had been a massive refugee crisis internationally like there was with Syria, this would have played out very differently. Even throughout the height of the conflict, there were tourists going to Colombo and the south of Sri Lanka, there were weddings happening, etc. And so I felt this real responsibility to tell this story correctly, and hence it took 7 years to produce it. So we went backwards and forwards with these people. At that point in 2013, I was starting to get Facebook messages from my old staff members, from my old friends in Vanni, who were popping up, coming out of torture cells in Sri Lanka. They'd been in there for 9 months, 1 year, being horrendously tortured. And again, I was thinking about this one girl who is in the book called Priya. Again, Priya is a fictionalized character, but based on this girl's experience. And I knew her in the Vanni. She was she was quite a conservative girl. She would always wear a perfect sari, jasmine in her hair, and she sung a lot. And she Facebooked me and said, I've arrived in London. And so I went to meet her in Croydon, and I went to her friend's flat that she was staying in Croydon, and that when I met her, she took off her blouse and stood in front of me in just a bra to show me the scars of what they had done to her in this torture cell. And it wasn't the scar, I was remembering this morning, it wasn't the scars and the cigarette burns all over her body that upset me so much. It was the fact that this girl that I'd known for years was suddenly standing in front of me just wearing a bra, and they had stripped that dignity from her. They had stripped that sense of who she was from her, that she could suddenly be in that state in front of me. And to witness that, to witness the shift of who this woman was and what had happened to her and where she was now. So we worked really a long time on her story and Priya's story. She's one of the characters in the book, lives out her experiences, which is just horrific. And so these were the kind of stories that I was collecting all the time. And what we found in the comic book, because it anonymized people, they had the ability to be able to tell their stories through that anonymization. And it was an incredible medium to work with. So Indran here, all the names that I'm saying have been changed. Indran here is someone who had witnessed a multi-barrel rocket launcher go off in a crowded area, like the crowds of people you saw earlier under the trees. And this is what he was living with inside his head, the constant explosions of what he had seen. And so he was able to sit with us, and Lindsay is just fantastic at being able to draw this. And I suddenly realized the medium of the comic book of animations, you can't take a photograph like this. This is trauma, and you're able to be able to illustrate this, and audiences can start to understand what it is that people live through and the trauma they live through.
I mean, the photograph would be, you couldn't take it and it would be too horrific.
Yeah.
And on film it would be too horrific.
Yeah.
And in a book, you wouldn't, in a written book, you wouldn't be able to tell
describe
it. This, I think, is one of the most graphic examples in the book of what you can achieve.
Exactly, and so you're not only able to get inside people's emotions and their heads to be able to show this kind of thing, but you're also able to get inside the torture camps, the sexual violence, the areas that journalists, filmmakers can't access these spaces. But when you sit with Indran or Priya, they can describe to you what happened, and Lindsay's able to draw it. And so we can go through, this is the UN evacuation area, that's me in the top there. I think Lindsay had a lot of fun drawing me. And these kind of images, and then on the beaches. And then using the graphic novel, the medium of the graphic novel, to also show the chaos. So Lindsay's so talented in able to show the kind of emergency of the situation by throwing these speech bubbles all around the page like this, and you get a sense of the movement, the urgency of it all, and the chaos, and the split conversations as people go through these conflicts, and then into the tigers who were fighting at the time. And the kind of drudgery of it through the monsoon, constantly battling through this conflict. And these are taken from survivors who were on that beach at the end, and being able to explain to us, the constant living under saris and sandbags, barricading them in from some of the world's most high-powered ordnance.
I think the eyes are amazing. I mean, on one level they're very simple, but on another level you can really see the fright. You can really see the people not understanding what's going on around them.
It is that it's. I think Lindsay will be all right to say this. So he worked just incredibly hard. For 7 years, this guy drew this book, and when I met him, he was drawing children's books and fluffy animals, and I said, this is the book you want to read.
And you can see the number of pictures that he drew.
Yeah, it's an incredible piece of work, but towards the end, we were getting up to the wire of, the publishers were asking us to submit this book, and so I spent a couple of days helping him colour in, and what I found was, it's interesting you said with the eyes, so he did all of the work. It was just a couple of pages. He trusted me enough to colour in the people, and you colour in, and then you leave just enough white around the eyes where you colour, and suddenly the whole character pops out.
Yes.
And it's incredible when you're working on that. You're kind of like, the character just pops out if you leave the eyes big or closed or whatever. And so exactly, the drama that you can play with the eyes is incredible. And again, these are all taken from film footage from our Channel 4 film. And you can see just the
I love
the
these lines that go through the pictures. In a different setting, they would be streamers for a party, but they're not streamers for a party.
No, that's smoke. Yeah. Exactly. So that's the aftermath of some of these conflicts. And then when we were doing the Channel 4 film, we started to get video footage from the Sri Lankan army, who, 3 years after the conflict, they had videoed the summary executions of tigers at the end of this conflict, and they were sending us, I think they were traumatized themselves at what they had done 2-3 years ago. And there's a huge amount of, there's a book in the bookshop by Susan Sontag, which deals a lot with photography and through conflict, and by getting these video footage, the young soldiers who at the time were brainwashed into vilifying
Square in London, part of SOAS, And one of the things he does with a non-profit company called PositiveNegatives is turning boring PhDs into entertaining graphic type
novels,
things.
yeah.
So let's move on very quickly before I open it up for questions.
Okay.
Your life at the top of this building in Russell Square.
The life at the top of that
building, distinguished link with SOAS.
Yeah.
You've now become an expert, and you're tracking immigration things across the world. So
quick note, elevator pitch. PositiveNegatives was born out of this book. This is the foundational stone of PositiveNegatives. So as I was working on this and on the PhD, so the PhD looked at the methods and ethics of creating this book. So basically everything I've just said, which is basically the PhD. You've just got to write it up into 80,000 words, but basically you've got it. That's what I did. And then produce this book from it. I then realized as we were producing this book that this was an incredibly interesting communications tool for representing complex research, academic research. PhDs are lost in university libraries. Academic research is read by academics and policy people. It's really important work. It's interesting work, but it's written in a language and it's housed in university libraries that lots of people can't access, and if they could access it, they don't understand it because it's written in a certain language. So this became popular of how do you tell these things through comic books. So I set up PositiveNegatives, and we now are currently working on 16 projects across 34 countries with various universities and professors who take my team in. I'm very proudly the head of an all-female team. I'm the only man at PositiveNegatives, and it is a young, dynamic team of awesome women who are postgrads in development studies and anthropology, and they now go out into the world as academics, as ethnographers, and interview people like Anthony there, that represent the research on conflict, migration, sexual violence, drug addiction, identity issues, etc., etc. And we now have a database of about 250 artists from all over the world who represent these pieces of work. And our methodology, which has taken a long time to get there, so now, no disrespect at all to Lindsay, but we are two white men, I know you don't like this bit, but we are two white men doing this book on Sri Lanka, and I found that problematic. I have a story to tell in Sri Lanka, yes, but if we were to do this now, PositiveNegatives would try and find a Sri Lankan artist, a Sri Lankan scriptwriter, and we try to do our work as much with local artists, local producers to produce their work, and we become the conduit, the producers of how we get those stories out into the world.
But Lindsay's work on this was absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, exactly. That's no disrespect to Lindsay at all, but
and what are the migration routes? I mean, they want me to open it up, and I will in about half a minute after this next question. The migration routes. Tell us about what.
So our biggest research project we've got is one that's just started this year, which is looking at the 6 largest global south migration routes, which are, it's a while since I looked at it. Okay, got it. Haiti to Brazil, Burkina Faso to Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia to South Africa, Egypt to Jordan, China to Ghana, Nepal to Malaysia.
He was looking at the map on his wall, I've seen it.
So that is a 5-year research project with multiple universities, multiple professors looking at the push-pull factors. Why do people leave Haiti and come to Brazil? The remittances, the labor laws, the gender issues, etc., etc. And that will look at all of these corridors, migration corridors, for 5 years. My team at PositiveNegatives will be embedded into that as a research method to extract the human lived story. So instead of looking at 10,000 women a year leave Haiti to become domestic workers in Brazil, we will write another book like this on a Haitian woman in Brazil and her lived experience with Haitian artists, Brazilian artists, etc.
But what's the audience?
The audience will be part of the academic research portfolio, but then it will also open, like I said, who reads academic work, academics and policy people. So this will hopefully come to literary audiences like here and open it up to other audiences.
Great. Questions? Well, in the front, straight here. Thank you. Anybody else? Hands, and I can spot one there. But this one first.
Yeah, this was basically a civil war, and the UN didn't intervene like they did in Somalia, I think, and earlier too in Congo. Why didn't the UN intervene in this case? Because this was basically a civil war.
So sorry, what was the question? Why did the UN not intervene in this in the Sri Lankan
case,
conflict?
yeah. Whereas they've done it in other countries.
Yeah. Do we want to take? So the UN didn't intervene in this case. The UN were not peacekeepers in Sri Lanka. Their mandate was purely development. And when the conflict started to spiral, the UN cannot impose themselves into Sri Lanka. They have to work with the government of Sri Lanka, and the government did not give us any movement to intervene as peacekeepers in this conflict. We were there to reconstruct after the tsunami, and when it turned into a conflict situation, they were quite happy to pull us out of that area. And the UN in New York unfortunately put very little pressure on the Sri Lankan government at that time for us to stay there and remain witness.
Another one in the front, then we'll go to the back.
Thanks very much for your work.
Thank you.
The families that you spoke with, can you say their feelings about India, the Indian governments, and the state governments at the Tamil Nadu level, their culpability? Do they feel anything about that? And can you also talk a little bit about what their feelings are about the people of Tamil Nadu? Perhaps we didn't protest enough from our space of comfort. Could you just talk about what their feelings are about this issue?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, the Sri Lankans that I spoke to had a very quite a distant relationship with Tamil Nadu. There wasn't, when they left Sri Lanka, they wanted to get to Europe, to Canada, to Australia, to places away from the situation. In 2009, after I came here, I went down to Tamil Nadu. There were the elections on in India in 2009, and the Indian Tamil population from Tamil Nadu were incredibly upset at what was happening to their distant brothers in Jaffna. But then when I really started to ask them who they were going to vote for, they were going to vote for the people that gave them streetlights and roads and better schooling. And it became quite clear understandably, where people's loyalties and voting records go. I know my Sri Lankan friends found it very difficult to be refugees in Tamil Nadu. At the time, there was the Secret Service looking for potential tigers who had slipped through the net into Tamil Nadu, and people were desperate to get out of India. There were lots of camps north of Chennai, and people found themselves in, again, almost out of the frying pan and into the fire when they came to Tamil Nadu. So it was not an easy situation for them at all. India also has a very difficult relationship post the Rajiv Gandhi killing with the Tigers and the Tamil population of North Sri Lanka. So I think that's probably a longer conversation for you and I over coffee. It's complex. Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Just looking for some perspective on the child soldier issue. Because the UN has often been strongly criticized of discrediting or underreporting the work done by the Tamil Tigers Peace Secretariat in complying with these standards. And they have also released child soldiers through the 2003 action plan with the UNICEF. Various child soldiers were released. So at one point when the international community was pressurizing the LTTE and discrediting them that they have not been complying with the child soldier issue. And later on, at the final parts of the genocidal war, abandoning them to the genocidal tendencies of the Sinhala army. How do you look at it, sir?
So yeah, that's very true. When I got there in 2004, there was a big push by UNICEF for no child soldiers in the LTTE ranks. And I can honestly say through the time I was there, 2005, 2006, beginning of 2007, there might have been some youngsters around 17 years old that I saw who had probably been taken before the UNICEF push came in, who had then grown up through the LTT ranks. But there were, as far as I could see, there were not recruitment of child soldiers at that time. Through 2008, as the conflict really started to spiral, my observations were that it was all hands on deck. it was going into the last big battle, and if you were of fighting age, which has nothing to do with UNICEF's standard of fighting age, you fought. And you know, one of the most tragic scenes I saw were empty schools all over the Vanni in the last few months before we evacuated, where these youngsters, 15, 16-year-olds, were being thrown to the front lines to fight. So all of those UN initiatives at that time went out the window, for sure.
Another question?
I have a question. So, hi. We speak a lot, the entire world speaks a lot about Holocaust, which was about ethnic cleansing. And if you see in the truest sense, what has happened in Sri Lanka is ethnic cleansing. There's no other way to look at it. So why isn't this being spoken about as much as, because everywhere across the world, Holocaust has been spoken about now and again, and Germans have been denounced because of that. Why isn't this being spoken about as much, and why isn't the Sri Lankan government being denounced by the entire world as much? That's my question.
My friend, I don't know. For 10 years, we have been pushing with the UN, the EU, the human rights initiatives to bring the perpetrators of this violence to justice. And the Tamil Tigers as well. The leadership of the Tamil Tigers were killed on the beach in May 2009. But also they, you know, and the Sri Lankan government, their pushback was also, well, they also killed. The Tamil Tigers killed, they brought the law, but they're not a state government. They don't have the responsibility of the civilians of that country. The government of Sri Lanka has the responsibility, whether the Tamil, Sinhalese, Muslim, Burgher, whatever. For 10 years, we've been pushing for justice of the army commanders and the Rajapaksa regime to face criminal charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Again, now he's president. This is the world we live in. We see this all the time. It makes me furious. It makes me, what do you do with this stuff? We keep pushing, and they keep being celebrated.
Anybody else? Before we finish, Yeah, there's one here. A brief one, because we're
it's a
almost
brief
on
question.
time.
Methodological question. What got lost when you moved from 20 stories to one story? I mean, I understand what was gained in terms of anonymity, but give me a sense of what got lost.
That's a really good question. Thank you. I guess I've got hundreds of stories in my head, but those 20 stories I obviously know so well. The amalgamation of 20 stories into one story, you will lose layers and layers and layers of people's lived experiences. We try, okay, what was really difficult was to not sensationalize the story. So you didn't want to pick the 20 worst experience, or the worst experiences of all 20, nor the lighter touches of all 20. So there's a huge amount on the cutting floor. I can't really think of one particular example, but there is the cutting floor of what we left out is another whole book. I can't think of one particular experience, but it's a really good question.
And the people are now living back in Britain and also abroad. Are they feeling persecuted? Are they still lying low, or do they think they've emerged?
It's different experiences. There are some amazing success stories. I have a wonderful friend in Zurich who is living a life now, married with children and a lovely apartment and jobs and others. There are other people I know who are living constantly traumatized by this experience and cannot move on. There's no kind of one lived experience, really. We all have individual ways of surviving and moving on from these experiences.
What do they all think of the book when you're in?
They love it. Yeah, one of the struggles with the methodologies of this book was to actually get critique. And when I would show them, scripts or storyboards, everyone would just say, "Oh, this is great, carry on." And you're just like, "No, I want you to critique it." But nothing like this has ever come out of Sri Lanka, or I believe really the subcontinent, of telling these stories through comic books and I think the best endorsement I got was in the UK Parliament the other day when there was a 14-year-old Tamil girl at a Tamil event told me that she recognises her story in this book, her life, her homeland in this book. She lived through the conflict as a young child, and how it's helped her, the book has helped her talk to her family and her friends about such horrors that she's experienced, and why she's now a part of a diaspora growing up in the UK. It like you said, it's not photography or film, it allows an easier access into trauma.
Ben, thank you. The clock's gone 10 seconds over time, which isn't bad. Thank you all for being here on a Sunday morning, and Ben, that was fantastic.
Thank you very much, Benjamin Dix and John Elliott. This session was presented by Mathrubhumi. Also, both of them will be signing their books right outside the bar hole on your left. Grab your copies, line up, and they'll be right there. Thank you.
Since its inception in 1923, and in keeping with this tradition, MBIFL was conceived. The third edition of MBIFL, held from the 30th of January to the 2nd of February at Kanakakunda Palace, Thiruvananthapuram, explores the shrinking spaces in society and showcases how letters cross boundaries, how the human imagination in the form of art and literature transcends the narrow walls of intolerance, hatred, and polarizations. This edition of MBIFL will also turn a new page in honoring excellence in Indian literature through the Mathrubhumi Book of the Year, a worthy recognition for writers from across languages. Mathrubhumi International Festival of Letters, showcasing the transcending power of literature.
For more details, visit mbifl.com. Tickets available on Book My Show.
To Huan, Rajasthan seemed something like this.